So Aoife, this is a moment that possibly you never imagined might happen.
No, we were really delighted to hear from our wonderful colleagues at the Ulster Museum when you told us about this celebration of National Gallery London's bicentenary, and it's really nice to be a part of it. And it's nice to reunite paintings that of course shared a home in the early 1600s, commissioned by the same person, Ciriaco Mattei, for the same palazzo. And seeing them reunited here in Belfast has been a really special occasion.
For me, the excitement, as you say, is bringing together works that were originally intended to be together in Rome. But so much later, now that we know so much more about Caravaggio, and to be able to look at them with 21st century eyes, really, with all that weight of history that's intervened in the time between.
Caravaggio, I think, is a phenomenon, really, in that, you know, he was shocking and interesting and new in the 17th century, and he remains fascinating and shocking today, and people really do feel struck and awed, I think, when they spend time in the presence of his works. The Caravaggios effect, as we see it in Dublin, is really quite extraordinary. And, you know, this is a painting, The Taking of Christ is a painting that is an absolute treasure and a highlight of our collection, of our display, generously lent to us by the Jesuit Community in Dublin. And it's one that people come from far and wide to see, and I know you've been experiencing the same here in Belfast.
So the fact that it's two very important religious subjects, illustrating really the beginning and the end of the Easter cycle, is something that I think our audiences are maybe less familiar with because they're much more familiar with our 20th century and contemporary collection. So that's making it even more exciting because people are responding to the narrative. It's a familiar story, but yet they're seeing it through Caravaggio's eyes. And as you were saying, that it's a phenomenon, and it's so fresh.
It's one of these things that we think that maybe this kind of biblical subject matter might not be as trendy as it once was, not to a 21st century audience, and yet people really are so engrossed. And I think really it's a testament to Caravaggio's incredible skill as a painter, the way that he paints his figures with this intense naturalism that remains as effective today as it did to a 17th century viewer.
People have come into the gallery and been immediately struck and have stayed for much longer than they even imagined or had planned to stay. And as you say, his ability to connect with the viewer is something that is almost visceral. People are so impressed. And for us, we're also seeing throughout the galleries, people are spending much longer looking at contemporary painting, abstract painting. There's something about Caravaggio that makes you look and really almost stops you leaving the canvas. You almost can't walk away.
I mean, I think his use of light is something that sort of transcends generations, really, isn't it? And with The Taking of Christ, I mean, he uses light really to guide us around the canvas, to sort of tell the story of the arrest of Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane. And we see, you know, it falls most intensely on the face of Christ as he sort of awaits his fate after the kiss of Judas, his betrayal from his great friend. And it's such a powerful thing. It's telling, as you say, a story that is so very well known, and yet his interpretation of it was very new in the 17th century and very different.
Yes, it's interesting to compare the light, because in the Supper at Emmaus, one of the reasons we've hung them in this way is that this is closer to the windows, and so we are getting this very high light coming down, as Caravaggio, we know, was interested in lighting from this very high source and from a single source. So we're able to, in a sense, connect with it, almost as you imagine Caravaggio might have seen it when he was painting it, you know, because it's almost like being in a studio with it. And also we've cut away any details, so we wanted almost to have nothing getting between the viewer and the painting. The closer you look and the more time you spend, the more interaction you really see between the canvases. I think that's what's really striking about seeing them together.
It's the first time that they've been together alone in a room like this, lit, you know, from the upper left with this intense natural light spilling onto the canvases, as you say, as it would have onto Caravaggio's live models when he worked. And I think that that's a brilliant, brilliant feat, really. And I think it allows us to really appreciate the pictures in a new way. And as you say, absolutely, this is how Caravaggio was working with these light sources from the upper left of his scenes. We know even from court records that he was in a lot of trouble for breaking a hole in the ceiling of his rented accommodation to allow this natural light to spill through. So it's so central to his narratives. Caravaggio tells stories not just through light, but also through gesture and expression. And what I think is wonderful here is, we see this moment, this instant in time suspended where the apostles are recognizing the resurrected Christ and throwing their hands up in kind of confusion. And here, similarly, we have gestures out of the canvas from St. John the Evangelist here on the left, who's reaching up in sort of fear and shock. They really do communicate with one another, don't they?
They really do. They're almost reaching out to each other. There's almost that sense of longing to touch between them. And then the self-portrait of Caravaggio in the corner, it's almost as if he's sort of turned into the painting to light it.
It's a funny thing. I think this is Caravaggio really illuminating his own scene. There's a sort of an arrogance in that, really, that speaks to his personality as we understand it from 17th century documents. But it's a wonderful thing to have a self-portrait like this. It sort of means that he's looking on this scene. He's not just a spectator, but he's a participant in this biblical scene, this moment. And he kind of encourages us to interact in the same way. The slightly parted lips, there's a sort of an introspective kind of quality. He's thinking, he's meditating, he's peeking over people to see what's happening, to, witness this drama as it unfolds.
It's that sort of constant comparison that really animates and almost creates, we're always using the word cinematic, but it truly is.
We know that the likes of Francis Ford Coppola and Martin Scorsese have really taken a lot of influence from Caravaggio. They've been inspired by his intense use of light, but also the gestures of his figures, the grittiness of the models that he uses. Of course, the way he poses them, he pushes them right up to the picture plane, he crops them at sort of waist height, and he uses, he paints people close to life size. So it's very much an experiential thing to look at a Caravaggio.
The seating that we've really wanted to almost emulate cinema, theatre, that, the sense of almost being in quite a small space and then having the projected images. And it's one of the benefits of this gallery, it's just really coincidence that the walls it's quite narrow, so it just seems to fit. So that the walls almost sort of push in on the composition, so there is that sense of forcing almost them together.
Sort of does what Caravaggio does with his own canvases, that he compresses his figures, at least in the Taking of Christ. We can see this kind of flurry of bodies that's being pushed, compressed together, and it increases this sense of tension and movement in the scene. It's almost like a spring that's been sort of wound up and is about to just explode. And I think that's the wonderful thing about Caravaggio. He suspends these instants in time, and he leaves us at kind of a precipice, doesn't he? He leaves you waiting, what's going to happen next, and you can feel the movement. You can feel that there's something about to happen, something big.
The armoured arm that is just cutting into the whole centre of the composition is...
And protruding out of it at the same time.
Yes.
And just like the basket of fruit over here, sitting at the edge of the table, again, we have that moment where you're like, it's about to topple over, is it not? He's an extraordinary artist, and it's such a pleasure to see these pictures together.
Another aspect of it that's been interesting, and I've heard lots of people pick up on it, is that they've become really absorbed with the biblical detail and seeing the symbolism, because there is so much symbolism in the Supper at Emmaus. When we opened the first morning, people were saying, but the faces of Christ are so different. And you almost feel that must have been almost what people were saying when they first saw them in Rome.
And of course, the Christ here is supposed to be unrecognizable. That's what the biblical narrative tells us, that the apostles dine with him, but they don't recognize him. And so it's a deliberate sort of juxtaposition between two very different faces.
Different.
Yes.
Exactly. And this idea of it's two Christs, but they are unrecognizable. You yourself are not recognizing the same figure.
He really does pay quite a lot of attention, as you say, to these biblical details. He paints pictures that really interpret the Bible in new and interesting ways.
He's really responding in a way, it's not, I've got to put more biblical narrative. He's loving the possibilities of the narrative.
It's often described as one of the greatest art history stories of the 20th century, this incredible discovery of what was, for a long time, a lost painting. So this work, as we know, was commissioned by Ciriaco Mattei in 1602, and it remained in the Mattei family collection for 200 years. And sometime during that period, Caravaggios' name was sort of detached from the painting, and it was accidentally attributed to a Dutch artist named Honthorst, who was a great follower of Caravaggio, of course, and a great imitator of his technique. It went from the Mattei family collection to a Scottish collector named Hamilton Nisbet, and from there it was sold at auction in Edinburgh, where a woman named Marie Lea-Wilson, who was a woman from County Cork in Ireland, came upon it while she was on holiday, and she had lost her husband. She had had a recent loss. This was 1924, and 4 years earlier her husband, Captain Percival Lea-Wilson, was assassinated. He was assassinated in retribution for mishandling of prisoners during the 1916 Rising. And so she encountered this painting in a moment of kind of real grief and loss in her life. And she bought it. She bought it for £8 in a gallery in Edinburgh. And she brought it back to Dublin, and she hung it in her Georgian house in Fitzwilliam Square. And there it remained for a little while, and meanwhile the Jesuit community in Dublin offered Marie Lea-Wilson grief counselling. And so in 1930, having really received a lot of comfort from the community, she decided to donate it to them and gave it to them, and they hung it in their house on Leeson Street, at that stage still thinking this was a Honthorst. And meanwhile, art historians were searching for the lost Caravaggio. And little did the National Gallery of Ireland know that it was 15 minutes down the road. It was hanging in the dining room of this Jesuit's home in Leeson Street. And in 1990, Sergio Benedetti, who was then the head of conservation at the National Gallery of Ireland, was asked to come to assess some paintings in the Jesuit's house for cleaning and restoration. And he came upon this. I mean, it's a once-in-a-lifetime moment, and Sergio was familiar with the lost Caravaggio, which was described in documents and came down to us in contemporary and later copies. And he instantly said, this is something we need to look at, we need to study this picture. And the Jesuits at that stage were very eager to cooperate, to collaborate with us. And for 18 months, it was analysed in the National Gallery, and a cohort of international experts came to look at it. And by 1993, it was unveiled as The Taking of Christ by Caravaggio.
The excitement is there of that first moment when it was unveiled, because it, as you say, it was so long lost, and it could so easily have disappeared.
It could still be hanging in the same home. It could have been sold. It could have been, I mean, I don't want to think about what could have happened. It's incredible, and the Jesuits very generously decided to give it to the gallery on indefinite loan so that our public, and now your public, can enjoy it, and enjoy it free of charge.
It began in the Palazzo Mattei, and for the moment, here it is in the Ulster Museum. I keep saying come many times, because each time the viewing is different.
Absolutely. Well, we're delighted that the Ulster Museum can be part of the story of the Taking of Christ too. So
wonderful. So we now have our role in the Taking of Christ.